Welcome back. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 looks at the autonomic nervous system. So let's dive in. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, it is composed of nerves that are found, cranial nerves, thoracic, a couple lumbar, and a few sacral nerves. So it's composed from stuff from the brain and the spinal cord. It receives sensory input from, as you might have guessed it, sensory neurons, and it will cause an effect and send it out on the motor neurons to innervate these muscles or glands to get it to do what it needs to do. Vasodilate, vasoconstrict, smooth muscle in the small intestine contract, smooth muscle in the small intestine relax. Okay? And there are a number of various different association neurons that help us to integrate this information and make sure that we have the appropriate response needed. A multitude of receptors that we'll start to get into here. And then we'll revisit this concept as we dive into all of the various different other systems, cardiovascular with the heart, blood vessels, respiratory, all that fun stuff. There are some subtle differences between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. When it comes to the somatic nervous system, it sends one nerve out. No cell body that really synapses with outside. Cell bodies are within the spinal cord itself. And just one neuron extends out and goes to the effector. And it's always a skeletal muscle. Should probably put that. Skeletal muscle. Okay, somatic means body. This is stuff that you control. Autonomic nervous system, it has a relay of neurons. There's always two, okay? It's always referred to as a preganglionic neuron, and the second one is referred to as the postganglionic neuron. Okay. First one, cell bodies are in the brain or the spinal cord, and then the secondary one, the secondary neuron is outside in the ganglia, sympathetic chain ganglia, splanchnic ganglia. All right. They're kind of found along chains along the spinal cord and also in clumps anterior to the spinal cord. Just depends on if you're in the thoracic cavity or in the abdominal cavity. And we'll see what these look like here in a second. So there you have it. You have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. So the preganglionic neuron extends out from the spinal cord to a ganglion, and then from that ganglion out to the effector is our postganglionic neuron. So it is significant to understand what's pre and what's post because it will vary dependent. It varies the type of neurotransmitter that gets released. Certain ones are only from pre, some are from post. So it depends on your neurotransmitter of choice. The effectors, when it comes to the autonomic nervous system, are unique. A lot of them have what's referred to as pace cells or autorhythmic cells. And there are a number of cells that will trigger contraction with some regulation, some input, if you will, from the autonomic nervous system, from different receptors in the brainstem or other locations. But for the most part, they act on their own, which is interesting. Excuse me, because if you cut a nerve here, they don't atrophy, unlike a skeletal muscle where if you cut that nerve, it atrophies. Again, there's only one nerve going out to the effector with the somatic nervous system. So when you cut that nerve, done. When it comes to the autonomic nervous system, as we start to layer in what these sympathetic or what these ganglia allow, you'll see that if that nerve gets cut, we don't necessarily have atrophy. What a lot of times happen is referred to as denervation hypersensitivity. And in this case, it just becomes more sensitive to the stimulation. Most of these organs that we're going to be talking about receive both sympathetic and parasympathetic input. So you could cut a sympathetic or a parasympathetic, one or the other, and it would cause some hypersensitivity. And it's a really weird phenomenon that exists, but it can be overly sensitive to parasympathetic. It can be overly sensitive to sympathetic, depending upon who's been cut, what nerve has been cut, what nerve fibers have been cut. Again, like I said, they contract rhythmically without nerve stimulation. Again, that is just because they have some intrinsic cells that set the pace for it. We'll talk about those when we get to those individual systems. Autonomic motor neurons can stimulate or inhibit, whereas somatic, it's always stimulation. Okay? Skeletal muscle gets input in and it contracts. Take the input away, now it relaxes. There's nothing inhibited there. You just take the stimulation away. With autonomic motor neurons, it can be triggering a stimulation or it can be triggering a inhibition. Kind of cool. But that's how your heart speeds up and slows down. Neurotransmitters, the somatic nervous system is always acetylcholine, and it's always excitatory. For the autonomic nervous system, we have acetylcholine, and we also have norepinephrine. Acetylcholine, norepinephrine, they can be excitatory, they can be inhibitory. It's a fun world when it gets to the autonomic nervous system. And it depends on, the receptor. Key, different lock. When we compare it, I have a few things in bold here. Those would be things that probably pay attention to. Ganglia, I should have highlighted that one too. My apologies, because it is something unique and different when you compare the two motor systems, the somatic motor system or the autonomic motor system. There you can see the effectors, skeletal muscle, and anything that's not controlled voluntarily. No ganglia with somatic motor, just extends out. Autonomic, we have paravertebral, we have prevertebral, we have terminal ganglia. We got a lot of fun stuff there. Number of neurons, again, one extending out. Autonomic, we have a pre and a post, so two. The effect, somatic is always excitatory. In the autonomic, it could be excitatory or inhibitory. For the type of nerve fiber, these are generally fast. These are usually, thick. So these are going to be really fast. Thick myelinated nerve fibers always send information fast. With the autonomics, there's unmyelinated, and then there's some myelination. So for the unmyelinated, they're very thin, so they're going to conduct, slower in retrospect, 2 miles an hour. The slow conducting ones, they have a little bit of myelination, not a lot, not like we see with the skeletal muscle system. Type of neuromuscular junction. It's a motor end plate in the somatic motor system. In the autonomics, it's a little weird because we're dealing with smooth muscle, which has these things called varicosities. So it's just way different. So I'm not going to really get into that one much. We'll talk about it later. What else? Denervation, again, denervation, hypersensitivity, and basically atrophy. It's flaccid paralysis. Paralysis because there's no nervous input. Flaccid because it's not stimulated to contract, and it atrophies.